Hello, beautiful people. It's Lulu. Welcome to the Lulu Essey podcast, where we build mental fitness, confidence, and self-love by following your own blueprint on your own terms at your own pace. This podcast is about personal growth that is truly yours. It's about doing the real inner work of building self-love and self-worth from the inside out. These are honest conversations about becoming who you truly are, with simple tools that meet you exactly where you are. This is unedited and always from the heart. I came across this question and it really got me thinking, and I'd like us to explore this over the next few episodes during May. What should we be talking about that we're not talking about? This feels particularly relevant right now for so many reasons, but especially because this month, May, is Mental Health Awareness Month. And that means your feed is probably about to be flooded, if it hasn't been already, with green ribbons and statistics and posts that say something to the effect of, "It's okay to not be okay. Check on your strong friend. Break the stigma." Those messages matter. They mattered enormously when nobody was saying them. They opened doors, they probably saved lives, and they made it possible for people to say out loud for the first time, "I'm struggling." And that was revolutionary. But now I'd like to ask a deeper question. Do you feel like we're still at the awareness stage? Because I don't think we are. I think most people know that mental health matters. I think most people understand, at least intellectually, that there's no shame in struggling. The conversation has definitely shifted. The stigma has not disappeared. But the awareness, to a significantly larger extent, the awareness is there. And yet, even with that awareness, more than half of adults who are experiencing a mental health condition are still not getting any help. And the average time between someone first feeling that something isn't right and actually getting treatment, according to the NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and their statistics are current as of 2025, that gap is 11 years. 11 years. That is not an awareness problem. That is something else entirely. And here's what I think may well be happening. And this is something I've been circling around on this podcast for a while. And now I'd like to bring it into the light so that we can examine it. We've all got really good at knowing. We've built an entire culture around naming the problem. We seem to be much better at the terminology. We're getting to know more and more about nervous system regulation. We know a lot more about trauma responses. And we are much better informed about attachment styles and cognitive distortions, as well as emotional dysregulation. We have so much more language for our inner world than any generation before us ever had. And if you've been listening to my podcast, you'll know that just a couple of weeks ago in episode 76, I talked about how that language, or the clinical vocabulary, can sometimes become the thing instead of the experience being the thing. We can get so busy studying our nervous systems that we forget to actually listen to our bodies. Let's go a little further than that, though, because there's a deeper pattern here, and I believe it goes beyond terminology. We seem to have confused awareness with action. We seem to have confused knowing what's wrong with doing something about it. And it seems as though we've confused understanding our patterns with actually taking action to address them. And I say we very deliberately because I've done this too. I talked about it last week. I knew the facts versus feelings tool. I had it in my toolkit. And when I needed it most, when I was spiraling over unanswered text messages and my mind was writing stories that felt so real that I forgot they were stories, I didn't reach for that tool, not for days. Knowing wasn't enough. Having the tool wasn't enough. I had to advocate for myself in that moment. I had to make a choice, an active choice to interrupt what was happening and use what I already knew. That is the gap. Not between ignorance and awareness, but between awareness and action, between insight and action. And I think it's the critical conversation we need to have this month. So, if awareness isn't enough, what is? I'd like to offer you a word that I think deserves far more attention than it gets, especially in the context of self-love and mental fitness. And that word is self-advocacy. Now, when most people hear self-advocacy, they may think of it as something that happens in a doctor's office or a therapist's room, speaking up about your treatment, asking us for a second opinion. And yes, it absolutely includes that. But I think self-advocacy is so much bigger and broader than that. Self-advocacy is the active practice of being on your own team, you being on your own team. It's the moment you stop waiting for someone to notice that you're struggling and you say it out loud. It's the moment you stop accepting a treatment plan that isn't working because you don't want to seem difficult. It's the moment you stop swallowing your needs in a relationship because keeping the peace feels safer than telling the truth. Self-advocacy is the moment you catch yourself spiraling and you make the choice to reach for a tool instead of letting the spiral run your day because the pull of that spiral is so strong. If self-abandonment, which we talked about in episode 74, is the quiet pattern of you leaving yourself behind, then self-advocacy is the practice of coming back to yourself. Self-abandonment is what you stop doing, and self-advocacy is what you start doing. Self-advocacy is not selfish. It's not aggressive or combative. It's not about being difficult or demanding. Self-advocacy is one of the most profound acts of self-love available to us, because it says, with our actions and not just our words, I matter enough to act on my own behalf. It aligns our words and our actions. And I'd like to make this practical because that's what we do here. I'd like to look at 3 places where self-advocacy shows up in our everyday life. Because I think when we see them, we'll recognize moments where we've either advocated for ourselves or where we've let the moment pass. The first is in our healthcare, and I want to share something briefly from my own experience. Some of you will know that earlier this year I shared a 3-part series on my experience with IV ketamine-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant bipolar depression. What I didn't talk about as much in that series is what it took to get there. The self-advocacy that happened long before the treatment. I had to research options that my doctors hadn't mentioned to me. I had to ask questions that felt uncomfortable. I had to push past the part of me that said, "Who am I to challenge the approach? They're the professionals." And I'm not talking about going rogue or dismissing medical advice. I'm talking about working with your medical team as an active participant, not a passive recipient. Asking, are there other options? Saying, this is not working for me. Those are not acts of defiance. They are acts of self-advocacy, acts of self-love. And I know how hard that is. I know the power imbalance that exists in a doctor's office, in a therapist's room, the fear of being seen as difficult, the voice that says, just do what they tell you. But your healing, our healing, is not a spectator sport. We are the most important people in our own care team. And that 11-year gap I spoke about earlier between knowing something is wrong and getting help, some of that gap is access and systemic failure, absolutely. But some of that gap is the quiet belief that we don't have the right to ask for more, for different, or for options, and we do. The second place self-advocacy lives is in our relationships. And this connects directly to what we talked about in episode 74, which was the self-abandonment episode. Every time we stay quiet when we have something real to say, every time we say yes when our body is screaming no, every time we abandon our own needs to keep somebody else comfortable, we are choosing against ourselves. Self-advocacy in relationships sounds something like, I need to tell you something, and it might be uncomfortable. Self-advocacy may sound like, I love you, and I also need this. Self-advocacy could sound like, I'm not okay, and I need you to hear that and know that. It doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be confrontational, but it has to be honest. And it has to come from a place where we believe, even quietly, that our needs are worth voicing. And the third place, and I think this might be the most overlooked, that self-advocacy shows up, is in our own inner dialogue. This is where self-advocacy meets everything we talked about with overthinking. When our mind starts building stories, when it starts presenting feelings as facts, when the inner critic starts its monologue, self-advocacy is the practice of interrupting that, not fighting it, not arguing with it, but stepping in and saying, I hear you, but I'm going to check the facts before I believe you. It's what I had to do last week. My mind had written an entire narrative about why someone I love wasn't responding to my messages. I had 47 stories. Every single one of them felt true. Self-advocacy was the moment I stopped believing them and asked myself, what do I actually know for a fact? Not what do I feel, but what do I know? Self-advocacy is in our own inner world, is the practice of refusing to let our worst thoughts run unchallenged, unchecked, unexamined. It's the practice of being our own ally in the moment where our mind is being anything but our ally. Here's what I'd like to leave you with today. It's a practice, something you can carry out of this episode and into your week, and hopefully into the week after that and beyond. The next time you feel yourself going quiet when you have something to say, the next time you feel yourself accepting something that isn't working for you, the next time your mind starts building stories and presenting them as the truth, I invite you to ask yourself one question. What would I do right now if I were truly on my own team? That's it. One question. Not what should I do? Not what would a confident person do? Not what's the right thing to do? But what would I do right now if I were truly on my own team? Because the answer to that question is self-advocacy. And the act of asking it, even if you don't act on the answer immediately, is already a step toward being on your own side. This month on this podcast, I'm going to keep asking the question, what should we be talking about that we're not talking about? Because I think there are several answers to that question, and they deserve space. Today, the answer to that question is self-advocacy. And next week, it will be something different, something else. But the thread that connects all of them is this. Awareness was the beginning, not the destination. If we want to make a meaningful difference in our own lives, we need to apply that awareness, that insight, and take action consistently. Every single episode of this podcast is around mental health awareness and how to take action. We don't need to wait for May to do this work. We show up for it every week because mental fitness, like physical fitness, is built through consistent practice, not through 1 month of posting green ribbons. If this episode spoke to you, I'd love for you to share it. Share it with people who need to hear that they are allowed to advocate for themselves, that they are allowed to ask for more, that being on their own team isn't selfish, it's essential. And you can also find this episode on my YouTube channel along with many shorts. Subscribe and follow. It does make a huge difference to me. So thank you. What comes from the heart reaches the heart. And today, my heart is asking you to stop waiting for permission and to start being your own champion. Not perfectly, not loudly, just honestly. One small act of self-advocacy at a time. Until next week, I'm on your team, and more importantly, I'd like you to be on your team.